Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you all this morning. And as I was going through my diary this week, it reminded me that it was actually 2 years ago when I was last with you in July 2024. And I think, gosh, where has time gone? And I'm sure as I'm getting older, that time is just getting faster and faster. And I believe that this month you have been looking at the topic of legacy. And the dictionary defines legacy as something that is handed down to us. Typically, it's in regards to finance or property. But as a Christian, I believe that God desires for us to hand down much more than our material possessions. He actually desires for us to hand down our values, our principles. He desires for us to hand down his love to the next generation. And he also obviously wants us to hand down our faith and a relationship with him. And he is much more concerned with our character and the way that we live our lives. He wants us to live intentionally, impacting other people with his grace, his kindness, and his truth. Now, this morning, I want to focus on leaving a legacy of good, healthy, life-giving relationships. And this is very much close to my heart because I have been, my whole ministry life actually for the last 32 years has been in this whole arena of building healthy, life-giving relationships. And so it's very much on my heart as I talk about this morning. We don't need to look far today to see that what prevents good relationships flourishing is often the inability to understand, to embrace, and to deal with conflict. We are witnessing it currently in many global wars, but we also experience it in our everyday lives, with our friendships, within our marriages, and also within our workplaces. And when conflict is handled poorly, or when it's ignored, and it then festers and destroys all that is good. And so this morning, I actually want us to take a deeper dive into how to do conflict well in order to build healthy relationships. And if you're like me, then you probably don't enjoy being in conflict. You may also think, gosh, if Nikki's been teaching this for 30 odd years, she surely can't have conflict with people. And our pastors, surely they don't have conflict. Well, let me tell you, yes, they do, and yes, I do, because we all experience conflict, whether that's with our spouses, with our parents, with our children, and with friends and colleagues. Wherever there is people, there is potential for conflict. So let's delve into this a little bit more detail. And I want to begin by sharing a key statement. I want us to understand that in order to build life-giving relationships, we need to understand the idea that conflict is an invitation to grow. It is not an obstacle to avoid. And if we can start here, if we can actually change our mindset and understand that it is indeed an opportunity, an invitation to understand yourself and others better, then we may just lean into potentially tricky conversations more easily and learn to grow through them rather than fear them and run from them. If you're here this morning exploring Christianity, or if you're online listening and trying to understand Christianity, then you may be encouraged to know that the Bible has a lot to say about life and relationships. And when talking about conflict, James, who was the half-brother of Jesus, he asks the rhetorical question, what causes fights and quarrels among you? He then goes on to say, don't they come from your desires that battle within you? So in other words, it's that natural struggle of our sinful nature. We want what we want when we want it. Conflict can also occur when our expectations haven't been met. And that could be somebody has said that they would do something and they haven't followed through. Or they've let you down and you're just ticked off. Conflict also arises due to our differences. No two people can share the exact same perspective. It is normal to think differently, to experience life differently, but we argue over our differences. And in order to make ourselves feel good, we then make others out to be wrong. Crazy, I know, but we hate to be wrong and we fight to be right. Or it can be that we have just been hurt. And that could be a current disagreement maybe that we've had with someone, or maybe it's something from our past. Maybe it's a childhood trauma. And what do hurting people tend to do? They hurt others. And because our hurt feelings tend to interfere with our ability to think clearly and to act calmly, we can then react out of all kinds of unhealthy patterns that were learned back in childhood. Now, for me, in my early years, my default pattern was to withdraw, to hide from potential conflict. And that was because growing up, I never saw or heard difficult issues tackled. They were just swept under the carpet. And in fact, whenever things did get emotional, people just left. Relationships just imploded. And so I developed a subconscious belief that conflict was bad and it needed to be avoided at all costs. And out of that avoidance belief grew a fear then of actually expressing myself. And that fear robbed me of the opportunity to deepen my relationships because I just wouldn't have the difficult conversations. Only when I learned to tweak that belief to a healthier one, which was, conflict itself isn't bad, it's how we do conflict that's key, then my marriage and my friendships and my other relationships all changed for the better. Dr. John Gottman, he is the modern-day expert in this whole area on relationships, and during his 40-year research study, he discovered insights into what he called the masters and the disasters of those in relationships. And he found 4 attitudes, and he actually calls them the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. So he found these 4 attitudes that when they are present and when they are ongoing, signaled the destruction of a relationship. And I remember when I heard this years ago, thinking at the time, gosh, I want to know what those are, because if I use any of those in my own relationship, especially with my husband, then I need to know what they are and eliminate those. So we're going to take a look at those. The first one is criticism. And this is when we frame a complaint. And it's okay to have a complaint, but it's when we frame a complaint as if there's something wrong with the other person. And it's when we're quick to put another person down. And it kind of might sound like this: you're lazy, you never listen, you waste money. Can you hear the tone? It's derogatory, and it's attacking the other person with you, and it's making them out to be wrong. And when we feel attacked, this leads to the second horseman, which is defensiveness. So rather than listen to what the person is saying to us and acknowledging their hurt and then take responsibility for our part, instead we can get defensive and we can counterattack. And that can be as simple as going back and saying, well, you do exactly the same thing, when they're trying to say something to us. We can also justify our behavior, or we can blame the other person. And when we're in defensive mode, we are closed off to listening and we are closed off to learning. Now, the third attitude is contempt. And this is when all respect has gone and we can take a superior stance, like we know better or we are better. And it can sound like, seriously, you don't know how to listen. Or it could be, communication skills are seriously lacking in your department. You know, you can just sense the condemnation in the language and the uncaring tone. And then the fourth one is stonewalling. And this is when we are physically present with the other person, but we are emotionally absent. So we may stay in the room with the other person, but we have emotionally vacated. And it's kind of like the talk to the hand stance. And this can show up as the silent treatment. And I'm sure none of us have used that, right? And I want to acknowledge that we've probably all used these from time to time. And when they're used occasionally, it isn't necessarily a problem, especially if we address it by apologizing and then asking for forgiveness. However, if these attitudes become habitual and they are how you regularly interact with a person, then the evidence actually shows us that this can lead to anger, isolation, or gridlock, and then ultimately resulting in a complete relationship breakdown. Now, in my younger years, I have to admit that I used defensiveness to keep myself emotionally safe, both in my marriage and in my other relationships. And we all have unconscious strategies that we adopt in order to get our core needs met. And these strategies are unknowingly formed in our childhood. Now, my earliest memories are as a 5-year-old in a children's home. And I remember feeling alone and emotionally unsafe. And even though I was only there for a year, with hindsight, I can see where my defensiveness came from. That need to look out for myself kept me hyper-vigilant and wary of people. And over time, that guardedness became a natural way for me to do life in general. I also learned in the children's home that to be accepted and to belong, I needed to suppress my needs, to please our caregivers, and to blend in. Not healthy, by the way. Others can behave differently in their defensiveness. They've learned to be aggressive and to fight for their needs or for their voice to be heard. And all of these learned childhood behaviors made sense at the time because they worked. They got our needs met. However, the problem is, as we grow older, we continue to live out of these learned childish behaviors without realizing that what once served us is now no longer useful. The Apostle Paul, who was one of the early leaders of the church, he made this great statement. He said, "When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put away childish things." The problem is that most of us don't put those childish ways of thinking and behaving behind us. And so understanding ourselves and choosing to put away these unhealthy self-protective patterns are essential for us to embrace conflict as an opportunity. It's an invitation to actually unlearn unhelpful patterns, to heal and then develop healthy ones and grow more like Jesus in the process. When we choose to understand our patterns and those of other people, we're able to quit then being self-protective, and we can instead press into tricky conversations with healthy, respectful self-expression. So practically, what does that look like? Respectful self-expression involves lovingly putting the issue on the table, so to speak, by doing as the Apostle Paul said, speaking the truth in love. Speaking the truth in love. So this means speaking honestly and directly, but with a tone of kindness. There is no place for brutal honesty and harshness when dealing with people. Hearts can easily be hurt, and while we cannot be responsible for how somebody receives our words, we are responsible and accountable for how we communicate. And by the way, Paul goes on to say, and I paraphrase here, he says that when we speak the truth in love, we are becoming mature in Jesus. So how can we do that? Well, before we bring something up with somebody, we first need to determine if the offence requires confrontation. Rather than instinctively react in the moment, it helps instead to pause, to take a mental step back and spend some time actually examining what happened. The book of Proverbs in the Bible has nuggets of wisdom, and one of them being that sensible people control their temper. They earn respect by overlooking wrongs. So in other words, not everything needs confronting. Don't sweat the small stuff, so to speak. And generally have an attitude that chooses to think the best of other people. People, if you haven't discovered this already, you will. People will do things that irritate us, and vice versa. We do things that irritate other people. My late husband, Andy, and Andy actually has been here and spoken at this church a couple of times, but my late husband, Andy, passed away in 2018 after a lifetime of health issues. And Andy was an incredibly resilient man, and he lived 17 years of our married life on a kidney dialysis machine. Now, when you're on dialysis, you can't drink fluid whenever you want to. You're only allowed 900 mils of fluid a day, and so he lived with constant thirst. He was forever thirsty. And one of the ways that Andy tried to alleviate his thirst was to eat apples because of all the juice in the apples. That's how he alleviated that. And so you should have seen Andy when he would eat these apples. He would take a bite out of this apple and he would suck the life out of this thing. And it was absolutely disgusting to watch and to be around. And it frustrated me so much. I tried talking to him many, many times about it, asking him to go in another room and eat it. But no, he just wanted to share that experience with me. And as much as I talked about it with Andy, he never changed in this area. He wasn't interested. Now, I needed to learn that Andy wasn't doing it deliberately to annoy me or to get me frustrated. He was doing it for himself. He was purely doing it to alleviate his thirst. And some of us would do well to remember the acronym QTIP, which stands for Quit Taking It Personally, especially if it is really just small stuff like eating an apple. But that poses a question though. How do we determine if it's just small stuff? And I decided that if it had the potential to become a major issue, if it could get in the way of an important relationship thriving, or if it was still causing me angst, say 24 hours later, then it needed addressing, preferably within the next 48 hours so that it didn't go on and on. So if we spent time examining the issue and we've determined, yes, it does need addressing, then the next step is to consider our own part in the conflict. So asking ourselves questions, and this is an internal question, such as what role did I play here? Or how am I contributing to this issue? They're wise questions to reflect on, and they give us insight into our own habits that need addressing. The next step is also an internal one. Are we willing to seek the other person's perspective as well as our own? Jesus' disciple Matthew stated, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there's a plank in your own eye?" And I think that sometimes we are too quick to point the finger at the speck our brother has and then instantly blame or judge the other person. So asking ourselves if we are truly willing to hear their side, their hurts and their disappointments, and not just focus on our own, are helpful questions to ask ourselves. And if we can honestly, in all humility, say yes, then we can know that we're ready to have that conversation. Timing is also crucial. Rather than just considering our own needs and schedule and what suits us, we actually need to consider what's beneficial for the other person. So simply asking permission shows respect. Just saying, is this a good time to have a chat about something? And when I've done that, sometimes I've been given the answer, no, not right now. Can we do it tomorrow? But most of the time, it's been, sure, what's up? However, if somebody says it's not a good time, or if you yourself have been asked that question and you think that's not a good time, that's okay to say, not right now. We need to honour that answer, but we also need to ensure that we do set a future time. And I'm not talking a year later, I'm talking like a day or a few days later, so that we're not using it as an avoidance strategy. And then above all, we need to take care with the words we use when we express ourselves. Remember this, you can't be too kind with people. When the time comes to finally speak, saying the truth in love requires us to be direct and honest. And some of us need to be told that being direct and clear is actually being kind. Let's make this practical, and let's say that you've had a tricky situation at work with a colleague and you're left feeling a little uneasy about it and you want to bring it up with this colleague, but you don't know how to do it. It can look like this. I'd like to talk to you about something that was said during our meeting on Monday. Is this a good time to have a chat? And I don't know if you were aware, but you said in front of our colleagues that I can procrastinate. And I found that comment hurtful, and I felt embarrassed and misunderstood. As a result, I don't know if you've noticed, but I've actually been avoiding you. I'm asking that in the future, if there's an issue, would you please talk to me privately about it rather than openly in a team meeting? I would really appreciate that. Now notice how that example contains 5 elements. So the first is gaining permission. So you're asking the other person if it's a good time to talk. Then it's telling the person what specifically they have done. You said in front of our colleagues that I can procrastinate. Thirdly, taking responsibility for your own emotions and feelings and then sharing them with the other person. I felt embarrassed and misunderstood. Fourthly, telling the person what the consequences have been. I've been avoiding you. And then fifthly, telling the other person what you want them to do. Talk to me privately rather than openly in a team meeting. Now, years ago, and this was a long time ago because my son is now 30, so he would have been about, I think, 16 or 17 at the time, my son Ben had acquired his driving license and he had borrowed my car and he hadn't filled it up with petrol afterwards, which I didn't know about. And so I went to work the following morning and I found the tank empty and I was ticked off with him. And so I spent some time thinking about how I wanted to speak to him because as a teenager, Ben could be very belligerent and I wanted the conversation to go well. And so as I thought about it and as I prayed about it, this is what I kind of said to Ben. I said, Ben, before you go out tonight, can I please have a quick chat with you? So I gained his permission. When I went to work this morning, the car had no petrol in it, and I had to stop urgently to fill it up. I explained what happened. I almost missed my meeting, which was very frustrating for me, so I shared how I felt, and that put me under a lot of unnecessary pressure, so I presented the consequences. Now, there may be a good reason why you didn't fill the car up, and if there is, please feel free to tell me. But I need you to be responsible for putting petrol in the car when you borrow it. Otherwise, it's not going to be available for you to use. So I explained what I wanted. Now, I prepared myself for a heated response from him because generally that's what we got. But instead, I couldn't believe it. He actually looked at me and he went, "Sure, my bad. Sorry, I can do that." It was no big deal. It actually went incredibly well. Now, it won't always be received so well by people. Just the other day, I actually did use this process with a friend, and initially, she got a little miffed with me. But I thought to myself, that's okay. She is entitled to her response and to her own feelings. My responsibility is to be respectful and to be kind with my words and to manage my own emotions. And I have done that to the best of my ability. And she did come round later. But these kind of interactions with people take time and need to be intentional. However, for people to feel valued and respected, we need to consider how we are speaking and take the time necessary to say something well. We can think that we have communicated what we want, but we're often not as clear as we think we are. And one of the most helpful skills is adopting what we call I language rather than you language. When we communicate to somebody using a you statement, it can feel very confrontational to the other person, and people can feel like they are being attacked. And often the reason that things can flare up is because we put up with issues or conflict for way too long before we actually say anything. We don't nip it in the bud. But instead, we leave things to fester away. And so when we do bring it up, there can often be a lot of emotion involved. It is way healthier to address things sooner when they are small. And we do this by taking ownership of our own thoughts and feelings, starting with an I statement. So let's go back to that work situation. Your colleague, say, is running late, submitting a proposal, and you're ticked off about it. Rather than saying, you're procrastinating, I just want you to take a moment, all of you, and just think internally how you would say that using an I statement. So rather than you're procrastinating, how would you say that using an I statement? It could be, I'm feeling frustrated that this project is now late. Or it could be, I'm annoyed that we are now behind time. In a dating relationship with you young ones, rather than saying, you never call or text me, I'm sure a guy doesn't say that, but maybe a girl does, you never call or text me. If you were saying it using an I statement, it would be, I feel like I'm doing all the initiating, or I'm feeling like I am not a priority right now. How about, and I hear this one actually a lot in marriages, you're not listening. Not going to go well? With an I statement, it would be, I'm feeling unheard. Or what about this one? You're bossy. Never a good idea to say that in a marriage. You're bossy. Again, if you're using an I statement, it would be, I'm feeling controlled. Can you see the difference? And maybe if you're in a flatting situation, again, you young ones, if you're flatting, rather than saying you don't do anything in this flat, using an I statement, it would be, I feel like I'm doing more than my fair share. Can we talk about how we can make a plan that works for both of us? You statements can tend to create more conflict or shut conversations down, whereas I statements tend to open up conversations. Now, I statements can still sting. They're not easy, but we need to have the maturity to pay attention to what the other person is trying to say to us if they are using an I statement. And also, if you're a couple and you're in a marriage, then and you both commit to using I statements, when you start using them, it's going to feel awkward to begin with, but persist, because even if you and your partner don't quite say it right, don't get disheartened. Just remind yourself that at least you're both trying. Choose to extend and offer grace to each other. And then after you've had a tricky conversation, it can be helpful to clarify and ask the other person what they actually have heard, rather than assume that we have communicated clearly. Because we can do that, can't we? We can think, we've said it, but the other person has taken away a completely different message. So it's good to say, okay, can we just clarify, and can you tell me what you think that I have just said, to make sure that we're on the same page. Things do get lost in translation. Expressing ourselves well takes time, it takes attention, and it takes humility, and also a teachable heart. And initially it may feel clumsy because it's probably unfamiliar to us. But the more that we practice something, then the more familiar it becomes, until in time it does become second nature. Remember that experiencing conflict is not a bad thing. It's an invitation, and if it's handled well, it provides a massive growth opportunity to deepen relationships. I can promise you that behind every good, flourishing relationship are a lot of tough conversations. You must be willing to say what you believe, to express what you need, and to confront what's not working. Don't avoid the hard conversations, because what's left unsaid can become assumptions that are unhelpful, and often untrue. Sometimes I think that we can be reluctant because we can also misunderstand Scripture. The Bible clearly tells us to pursue peace, to make peace the prize. And it says, and I noticed it was in the bulletin this morning, it also says, as much as it depends on us to be at peace with everyone. And I love that verse. It was something that I taught our kids for years. And of course, that is all true. But we can misunderstand and think that we are called to be peacekeepers, which is not true. We're told to be peacemakers, and it's helpful to know the difference. So, what is a peacekeeper? Peacekeepers walk on eggshells so as not to upset anybody. They can be people pleasers. They don't share their true feelings, and they can be passive aggressive. They often avoid tricky conversations, and they're often victims, and they're often resentful. This is not peace. Peacemakers, on the other hand, are intentional, and they are committed to truth-telling in love. They directly communicate their feelings with kindness. They take responsibility for their actions, and they initiate resolution. They are quick to forgive and to ask for forgiveness. They are often humble, and they are teachable. This is courageous action, and this is what we are called to do. In fact, Jesus himself said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." He is reminding us that those who work through conflict are favored by God. In order to leave a legacy of good relationships, we need to understand that conflict with others is inevitable. But when we stop seeing it as something to avoid, and we start seeing it as an invitation to develop our own skills and invite Jesus to help us, everything changes. Picture this. You walk into work and there is no tension in the air. There's no hushed conversations quietly by the coffee machine there. Why? Because you and your colleagues have learned to address issues directly and kindly. You've discovered the relief that comes when you can share concerns without fear of being attacked. Imagine marriages where couples don't tiptoe around each other or let resentment build up. Instead, they lean into tricky conversations with curiosity and a real desire to understand the other person. These couples don't have fewer disagreements, but they do have healthier ones. and they actually bring them closer together. Think about your kids growing up, seeing conflict handled with grace. They learn that you can actually love someone deeply and you can still work through those differences. And they then enter relationships much more equipped because they have seen what healthy conflict looks like. Here's the thing, when we stop running from difficult conversations and we start running towards the growth that they offer, something beautiful happens. We discover that on the other side of that scary conversation is often deeper connection and the joy of relationships that can handle reality. And this is what Jesus meant when he called us peacemakers. Not people who avoid conflict, but people who courageously work through it to create genuine peace. So here's our challenge. Commit to leaving a legacy of healthy relationships by viewing conflict as an invitation to grow, not an obstacle to avoid. Conflict is there, it is waiting to teach you something about yourself, about others, and about God's grace. So this week, can I encourage you to talk to God and ask him for his strength and his help as you begin to apply what we've actually heard this morning. Commit to putting this stuff into practice in your everyday lives because it's way too important not to.